All right, this third lecture is going to cover parties and elections and how people vote, what are the characteristics or influences on how people vote. So we'll talk first about why do people run for office? That is, what are some of the benefits of holding office? And there is some financial rewards and some long-term security because of pension, but the president makes about $200,000 a year, so over the course of the term of the president, he'll make $800,000. Congress has provided the president with a pension, as well as if you're a widow of the president, you also receive a pension. And then there's a salary for the vice president, who receives over $115,000 a year, and senators and representatives get about $90,000, although if you're the Speaker of the House, you probably make more than that. But those financial rewards and long-term security don't seem all that high relevant to or relative to how much those individuals might be able to actually make in the private sector. So it's not financial rewards, obviously, that is going to be the major benefit. A bigger benefit is status. The candidates are trying to climb what's called the opportunity structure. And they try to move up the ladder from, let's say, a local office to a state office to the House of Representatives to the U.S. Senate to the governor's office. And so with each step of that ladder, the candidate gains in status and prestige. There are times, however, that people can skip to the top of this opportunity structure, to the top of the ladder, if their name is known for some other reason. So, for example, John Glenn, the astronaut, became a U.S. Senator. Ronald Reagan became a governor of the state of California after he was through acting, and then, of course, became the president. But politicians also run for another reason. The major benefit for why they want to hold office, or the major reason why they want to run for a particular office, is because of personal concerns. They want to get involved with the political process because they want to affect change in public policy. So regardless of what we might think about politics today, I think most people enter into politics because they have a desire to change public policy. But of course there are certain costs to being a candidate. Okay, the loss of privacy, the loss of leisure time. The candidate must endure thousands of speeches, press conferences, fundraisers, numerous other types of banquets, what Washington insiders call the rubber chicken circuit, because of all the chicken dinners you have to eat. And each candidate has to measure the cost versus the benefit when he or she decides whether or not to run. So, for example, in 1974, Walter Mondale started a campaign for the presidency, but decided to drop out because he didn't, quote, want to be president badly enough to go through the fire of a presidential campaign. He would later run in the 1980s, but in the 1970s, he decided he really wasn't wanting to go through that process. Mario Cuomo cited lost time with his family as one reason why he chose not to run for the presidency in 1988. And Rudy Giuliani chose not to run for senator in New York due to his health, but probably also because of the opposition of Hillary Clinton, who went on to win that seat as a senator in the state of New York. You also have to kind of think about what are your odds of winning, and do you want to go through the process of going through a tough, demanding campaign if there's real no chances to win. However, there are individuals who, as part of their calculations, try to think of what can be gained from the candidacy itself. So, can I gain something from simply being a candidate, even though I'm not going to be the winner? Jesse Jackson and George McGovern are two good examples of this, who ran for the presidency in the Democratic primaries for the 1984 nomination. And both knew that they had little chance of actually winning, but each had something to gain, even though they really didn't have a chance to win. So for Jesse Jackson, he was looking to make himself a more recognized force in American politics. He wanted to register and unite black voters and also aid other black candidates for public office, and has since been very successful. George McGovern had been defeated in a landslide defeat in 1972 to Richard Nixon, from which he never really recovered. So in 1984, by appearing on stage, debating with the other candidates, he showed himself to be a good, clear thinker and was witty and likable, probably dispelling the myth that he was a radical, unthinking, bleeding heart liberal. So he really wanted to somehow recover his reputation to some extent. So these candidates have to think about, what can I gain even if I don't win? And we know that even if you don't win, you might have a place in American politics, and we see that with Sarah Palin in this go-around where she has been very influential in trying to help candidates, or perhaps she's also been influential in helping the opponents garner support as well, because she's a very polarizing figure in American politics. All right, well, what's the path? Does previous experience help in becoming a president? And so president since 1868, what was the last position that was held before they became president? There have been no U.S. representatives who went from being a House member to the President of the United States. There have been quite a few senators, 5, Garfield, Harrison, Harding, more recently John Kennedy, and then since John Kennedy, only Barack Obama. There have been quite a few governors that became president as their previous post. Hayes, Cleveland, McKinley, Wilson, FDR, more recently Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Clinton, and of course George Bush from Texas. There's been a couple of federal appointees. They were federal appointees before becoming President of the United States. Hoover was Secretary of Commerce. William Howard Taft was Secretary of War. There have been vice presidents who have become presidents, but only 2 because they were elected. Richard Nixon was the vice president for Dwight D. Eisenhower, and then George Bush was vice president for Ronald Reagan, and they both won their own elections. But the rest took office due to the death of the president or due to a resignation. So you had Teddy Roosevelt, as I showed in the previous lecture, became president when McKinley was assassinated. Truman becomes president when FDR dies in office. LBJ becomes president when Kennedy is assassinated, and Ford becomes president when Nixon resigns. And there's been 2 presidents that had former experience as a military leader, Eisenhower and Grant. So their high-profile previous jobs is helpful. The governor's ship is tending to be the path to the presidency that's most frequently traveled. All right, well, how does this process work? So let's just look at this process of how you become the President of the United States. Well, first of all, you need to have some money. It's called the money game. And in recent years, it's been clear that the money game is primarily important. One researcher wrote that in every election since 1976, the candidate with the most money raised and matched at the end of the year preceding the election inevitably became the nominee for the general election. Okay? So you have to have money, and you have to have a lot of money. And then states can choose their delegates to the National Convention in one of 2 methods. And so in the terms of nominating, you can have a caucus, all right? And this is where we have the Iowa and the New Hampshire caucus in terms of the stages. The Iowa caucus is always first, and New Hampshire primary then comes generally after that. Okay, so a caucus simply means a meeting. Okay, so votes are taken in every precinct at these meetings, and each precinct caucus people declare their allegiance to a candidate, and then they send a proportional number of delegates to the county convention. The county convention votes on what delegates will go to the state convention, and the state convention votes on what delegates will go to the national convention. So it's really a staging process in the caucus. But the caucus is the first indicator of who is going to be a primary player during the primary season. But most states today have a primary, which is a selection of delegates by a vote of the people. And we have 2 primaries, an open and closed primary. So the purpose of the caucus and the primary is not only signal who wins that in terms of, is Romney going to win the primary, is Newt Gingrich going to win the primary. We know that Barack Obama is going to win the Democratic primary. But it also elects delegates to cast those votes in the national conventions that happen in in August. July and August. All right, so is there an open or a closed primary? An open primary is when any qualified voter may participate regardless of their party affiliation. And so you can crossover vote. If you're a Republican, you can go vote in the Democratic primary. This year, the Democrats pretty much know that it's going to be Barack Obama, so if you're going to be voting in the primary in the state of Texas, for example, maybe you'll go and vote in the Republican primary. A closed primary allows voters to vote only if they are a member of the party. So you have to be a registered member of the Democratic Party to vote in the Democratic primary, and you have to be a registered Republican Party member to vote in the Republican Party. Okay. So if we think about this, the primary calendar, you'll notice here that the purpose of the calendar is to tell when votes are going to occur, but as you move through the calendar, the number of candidates starts to whittle away. So some people argue that the folks who have the primaries early in the year, this column here, they will have already decided for these folks over here who the candidate's going to be. You can see that April 3rd was the day that Texas was going to have its primary, but that has changed. It's going to be on May 29th all by its lonesome over here. And that is primarily because of the fact that there was a lawsuit brought about in terms of the reapportionment that was happening in the state of Texas. So because of the 2010 census, the state of Texas got 4 new seats, but there's been disagreement and lawsuits about how those seats should be reapportioned. And since that case hadn't been settled in time, the state of Texas had to move its primary to May 29th. So by the time that the primary happens, many people are going to argue that Romney is probably going to be the candidate, so Republicans in the state of Texas really have lost their choice. And so many people will probably not turn out to vote in the Republican primary. And so you can see that this is one of the issues of the primary calendar, is each year these states keep trying to move themselves up closer and closer to an earlier date. Okay, so the impact of a Super Tuesday, for example, tends to diminish. This is usually the Super Tuesday, a time in March where you have a lot of primaries in one day. So you have a lot of votes up for grabs for the nominee to the national convention. Okay, but Super Tuesday has been decimated in recent presidential elections because people keep, and I say people, states keep trying to jump up and be part of this early process. Okay, then you have the national conventions after all the primaries are over, and this is where the delegates chosen in the primaries and caucuses actually vote. The vast majority of them are tied by law to vote in a certain way on the first ballot. So, for example, in Massachusetts, their law might say that the delegates have to vote the way the voters did in the primaries. So if the voters in Massachusetts voted for example, if Romney won the Republican primary in Massachusetts, then the delegates at the National Convention have to vote for Mitt Romney. Okay. Both parties use majority rule. The purpose of this is to give the candidates a public opinion boost and demonstrate unity by each party for its candidates. Okay. So after the national conventions, when each of the parties officially nominates their candidate, then you move from the national convention to the general election. And this is usually a 2 to 3 month time period. Well, it's from July, August to November. And so this is where you're going to have Barack Obama running against probably Mitt Romney. And then we're all going to go to the general election in November. Okay. So how do you win? What are the keys to winning? Well, let me first tell you the general election takes place on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. That's when we're going to be at the polls. So the keys to winning is start to campaign early. You have to be, and Iowa's not on here because it's a caucus, right? So it's way up here. It had already occurred by the time this came out. So you have to start early campaigning in Iowa, New Hampshire, and whatever other states are early on in the calendar. And this is important because picking up a win early is vital if you're going to demonstrate you're the candidate to beat. Okay, you can win by being in the middle of the road in relation to the citizens who are voting. And so remember, if we talked about before, why we're a two-party state, in the primary you have to really appeal to your party base. In the general election, you have to be more middle of the road. You have to be attracting that moderate voter. You have to think about building a winning coalition. So you have to try to put together groups of people that you can appeal to. One of the coalitions that's in the news right now where the Republicans are suffering, and this is to the advantage of the Democrats, is the woman voter. And many people are looking at the 2012 election as the war on women from from the Republican perspective. That many people argue that the Republican Party is waging a war on women in terms of women's rights. And so we'll have to see whether or not that coalition of women voters really tends to stay away from the Republican candidate. Okay. So that's the key to winning, is you have to form a coalition. So why do people vote the way they do? We know that one of the reasons, or one of the main reasons they vote the way they do, is because of party identification. Okay? And party ID changes for a variety of reasons. And we can see that there is a rural, urban, and suburban split. We can see that suburbia in the United States is dominated by the Republican Party, whereas urban is more dominated by the Democratic Party. Okay. And then rural is also a place where Republicans have a slight advantage. Now in Texas, we haven't talked a lot about parties in Texas or elections in Texas, but remember, Texas used to be dominated by the Democratic Party. You couldn't get on the ballot if you were a Republican early on after the Civil War, because Republicans were seen as the party of Lincoln. But over time, the Democrats have switched over and become Republicans or independents in this state. So you can see the decline of Democratic party identification in the state of Texas. Okay. It's argued that 40% of voters know who they're going to vote for before the actual election begins and the party has a candidate. And this is based solely on party ID. So oftentimes, people who have strong party identification tend to be those who straight ticket vote. That is, you go in and you can, in November if you haven't voted, the first thing they ask is if you want a straight ticket vote. And so if you're a Democrat, you can plug the Democratic ticket, or if you're a Republican, you can pull the Republican ticket, and then you're done. Your voting takes about 2 seconds. Other people want a split ticket vote, and that means they're going to vote for different individuals based upon what the office is. So it might be that in the general election for the president, you vote for a Democrat, but for the U.S. House member, you vote for a Republican. That's called splitting your ticket. The other reason why people vote the way they do is because of certain candidate attributes. Image is becoming more and more important in recent years as the media has become more important in campaigns. And so how the candidate looks on TV has become an important factor to the voter. And this is particularly true for women. Women get really brutalized in the press about how they look in terms of their appearance, in terms of how old they look, do they look tired, and so these types of attributes might matter. So another attribute are the candidate's gender, like I said, and race. Whether a candidate is a man or a woman or black, white, or Hispanic is a factor which can sometimes be important depending upon the makeup and the views of the constituency. Okay. A third possible factor, and your book talks about this, is that people vote based on issues. And there are really two types of issues that are important. One of those is the economic issues, obviously. This seems to have an effect on congressional and presidential elections. And then there's going to be moral issues, more so in the past as opposed to this year, where I think the issues are going to be economic issues and the conflicts, war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we know that abortion in the last few elections has been an important issue and will probably raise its head again. So there's probably three major issues that people vote on: economics, the wars, the cost of military, as well as moral issues. And there's two types of issue voting. One is called retrospective voting and one is called prospective voting. Retrospective voting argues, or this concept argues, that voters punish or reward the incumbent for their past performance. And this is usually couched in terms of economic performance. If the economy is performing poorly or unemployment is up, voters will oust the current president. Okay. So if you tend to think about judging someone based on past performance, then you are retrospective voting. Prospective voting, this is the idea that political support is driven more by your economic expectations. There were several political scientists who argue that the public behaves more like bankers rather than peasants. That is, peasants are interested only in the current state of the economy, while bankers focus on the future of the economy. So if you're banking on the future, then you might be a prospective voter. And this assumes a pretty sophisticated electorate. By and large, the majority of people are retrospective voting. Okay, so if asked which is more likely, it's retrospective voting. All right, well, messed up on the slide again. All right, when it comes to these different group affiliations, when it comes to party identification and how they vote in terms of the electorate, there are some trends, and these are just generalizations. There is a gender gap, as I showed you in the very early on in the first lecture. More women tend to identify as Democrats and more men tend to identify as Republicans. When it comes to religious breakdown, 90% of Jews in America identify themselves as Democrats, whereas the evangelical Christians in particular, but Protestants and Catholics are more likely to identify as Republicans than Democrats, although this Catholic vote is pretty split. Some more group affiliations. In terms of class, it doesn't break down as cleanly. We tend to think of Republicans as the party of the upper class, with Democrats the party of the working class. But racial barriers did begin to fall in the 1970s, so many white working class people did tend to vote for Republicans starting in the 1970s. Those lower on the socioeconomic scale still tend to support the Democratic Party. In terms of ideology, we know this. There's very conservative support for the Republican Party, and those more liberal tend to support the Democratic Party. There are some regional differences. Republicans are strong in the South. Democrats are strong in the Northeast and Midwest. That tends to be their strongholds. And here you can start to see graphically, I think really kind of tells the tale, that these are the elephants, of course, are the Republican Party. This is your Democratic Party, and the individuals are your independents. And you can see that that when it comes to men, it's pretty split. Even though the previous slide said that men are more likely to be Republican, it's pretty evenly split, and many of these independents tend to vote in the Republican Party. So that's where you get that more tend to be voting for Republicans. There is definitely more support for women. More women support the Democratic Party. In terms of age, now again, as you age, it tends to be a little bit more conservative, but the younger you are, the more liberal, or the more likely you are to be attracted to the Democratic Party. When it comes to race, you can see here where minorities are definitely more in favor of the Democratic Party. And then here you have that income disparity. As your income increases, you're probably more likely to favor the Republican Party. Regionally, the South has more support for the Republican Party, but there's no region where there's that big of a difference. There's some split, but you have a lot of independents. But in the East, here's where you see that the Democrats really being dominant here, and out West as well. In terms of education, it's kind of split. There really is no perceivable trend here. The less educated tend to be more for the Democratic Party, but then once you start getting into the educated area, you don't have that big of a difference from high school graduate to postgraduate. All right, so when we look at these different factors, we can see, that there is much higher rate here for the Democratic Party, where we see in these different groups, these different groups of individuals, where Democrats have an advantage. So the question is, why don't Democrats win every single election? If people voted by their socioeconomic status alone, Democrats should win just about every election. But we know that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote. That's just factual information, that in election after election, the wealthier people tend to be more mobilized to vote. So the more poor you are, the less likely you are to vote. And so that is seen, and it is a problem in politics in the United States, because the people that need the government most to help them are less likely to vote. And so I don't want to end on a bad note, but other than to say the Texas primary is on May 29th, so hopefully you are registered to vote and will be able to participate in that primary. All right, that's where we'll stop. Next week is interest groups and participation, and that will be our last unit before the final exam.